Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Akins. I'm the director for the Mentoring Education and Career Development Corps for the CTR, and I'm also affiliated with the Delaware INBRE. And thank you for joining me today. This is the Junior Investigators Network meeting for December 2015. And what I propose we talk about, we can change depending on what you really want to talk about, are a funding mechanism, some ideas about structuring specific aims, and kind of my experience with study sections, both as an applicant and as a reviewer, and what you can expect from study section, and sort of how to make sense out of the critiques that you get back. So first, I'd like everyone to know, the junior investigators in particular, about a new pilot project program announcement that came out from the Delaware INBRE. It was just released this week, I guess the end of last week. So if you haven't seen it yet, you can let me or Aaron know, and we will send you the RFA. But it's designed to attract new investigators. If you're currently funded by an idea state mechanism, the CTR, or one of the COBRE grants, you can't have funding from both, can't have concurrent funding from both. But other than that, there are very few restrictions on what the program will sponsor. The INBRE is focused, based on the agreement with NIH and sort of how the grant's structured, on neuroscience, cardiovascular, and cancer research. But those topic areas are very broadly defined. And in fact, if you read through the RFA, which admittedly is 22 pages long, if you read through the RFA, it talks about how you can link other health problems, particular health problems in the state of Delaware, if you can link them back to one of those three broad areas that you're considered eligible to apply. The reason I'm bringing this up is, one, to make you aware of the program itself, but then to also show you or tell you about something that's a little bit different. I'm just going to scroll down here. So typical pilot programs, I'm going to zoom in 1 second. So typical pilot programs are based on a pilot investigator working with a mentor or a mentoring team, and I think we're all familiar with those kinds of investigations. In reality, NIH is funding more and more team science and multidisciplinary science. So we tried to figure out a way to encourage people to start working together as teams, even as new investigators. So the INBRE pilot mechanism will also fund collaborative efforts. So I'm just going to, you can read all about how this would work, but we're encouraging pilot investigators to submit together. So if you have another new investigator who's working in a similar area, and you have synergies that we can leverage by funding both of you, we want you to apply as collaborators. It's around a general single research problem, and we're thinking joint publications or multi-PI R01s would be an ideal target, but that's not a necessity per se. But we would like to stimulate people to work more together collaboratively. There's also, and somewhat more complicated, something that we've been talking about as dream teams, which are teams of investigators working together with a senior person. So the INBRE pilot mechanism will fund, if you have more than 2 people working together as a group, you can form an integrated research team and identify mentors and a senior investigator who acts to coordinate and help direct the overall research effort. Again, these would have to be unified themes, and how the funding would work and how the support would come from the INBRE to support these dream teams is explained in the RFA. But if you're already starting to work collaboratively, say you have someone that works on big data and you're working in the hospital or one of the hospitals, and you have a collaborator at the university who's working on mechanism, that you can unify those groups together using this team-based approach. So I would encourage all of the junior investigators to take a look at it. You have to be an NIH new investigator, which means you haven't had an R01 or a substantial NIH grant before. You don't have to be an early stage investigator, although that helps. So if you're transitioning from one NSF funded type research to NIH funded research, you may still be considered a new investigator. All right, so that's to make you aware of the mechanism. If you're going to apply, I strongly urge you to scroll way down here. Sorry if this is giving anyone a seizure. right? To use some of there's a tool in particular that I attached to the RFA, and I'm going to transition now to talk about submitting grants, particularly to NIH study sections. So I encourage people to put their pilot grants together as though they're applying to NIH, because that helps down the road. We want you to apply to NIH eventually, and use some of this guidance that's provided here. So I'll talk a little bit about structuring specific aims and getting ready to submit. And then we'll talk about overall kind of strategies for preparing a submission to NIH, and then what to expect from study section. So this is information that I digested from Rick McGee. So I acknowledge him at the bottom. It's in small print down here. But he shared some of the analyses that Northwestern University had done on successful specific aims pages. So they actually went through and did a rhetorical and sort of semantic analysis of successful aims pages and came up with key components. And there's a couple of YouTube videos that explain this, and the link is here, and it's in the RFA, and I can share this document with you as well if you're interested. But I always thank Rick for starting this whole thing. And I and other people have used their experience and their information, and what I've done is digest it down into a checklist that I like to use in reviewing specific aims for other people, but it's also helpful in putting together specific aims. So these areas, which are pretty broad, are represented, almost all of them, not always all of them, but successful aims pages, successful grants have aims pages that cover these topics. Right, so you want to make sure that when someone reads your specific aims page, just the one-page part of your grant, that they understand the big picture and the context. Why is this a significant thing? What are you working on? How many patients have this problem? How big is this economically? How big of a difficulty is it? What's the problem that you're addressing, and the long-term goal, sort of specifically articulated. So not just that you're going to make the big picture better, but you're going to come up with a better diagnosis, or you're going to better define educational programs in that area long term, and then narrow pretty quickly down to the specific thing that you're going to do with this grant, with this application. And these don't always flow in this order, but you want to explain what complication, what's the specific unanswered question, like the guiding hypothesis behind the grant. That's being addressed. What's the whole? What don't we know that you're going to address by focusing on this narrow area? And then talk about your specific goals. All right, we're going to accomplish this. We're going to develop this tool. We're going to test this particular hypothesis. So a lot of these things probably make sense to you, but having this checklist in front of you as you look at your aims or structure your aims is incredibly helpful. One of the things that junior investigators in particular tend to leave out is why you, and it doesn't have to be much more than a sentence or two, but saying things like, my group has worked in this area for the past X number of years, or we have a collaborative effort with so-and-so and have looked at this population before. That helps the reviewer understand why they should give you the money. And at the end of reading the specific aims page, you want the reviewer, the reader, to go, this is a big problem. That's a great idea. This is the person who should be doing the work. Because then a lot of the battles that a lot of the hurdles you have to overcome have fallen. They're already on board with you being the one to do this necessary work, right? And you additionally, down in this checklist, it talks about some other things with your aims, making sure that your aims flow from your central hypothesis. And that's meant to be in the mind of the reviewer, that they read the hypothesis, and then when they read your aims, they understand why you're doing that, why that specific aim is there, and that there's a sort of a specific idea that's being tested with each of the aims. Whether you say it or not, it should be clear from the way the aims are structured. In a lot of cases, you just specifically say, this is the hypothesis we're testing with this aim. You want the aims to be independent in the sense that if you can't accomplish aim 2, that aim 3 still makes sense. You want things to sort of flow conceptually, but not to lean on each other so much that it's considered a flaw, that it's a risk. If you can't accomplish aim 2 and everything else falls apart, you don't want the reviewers thinking that. And you want to make sure that you sort of articulate what you'll get, what the aim will tell you when it's all accomplished and said and done. All right, and then you conclude why it's novel and make sure that it's clear that what you do in this kind of loops back, addresses the long-term goal that you said you wanted to get to, so they can see your trajectory, especially as a new investigator. You want to be here, and this project helps you get along that trajectory and improves the big picture problem associated with the health condition. So when if you're going to apply for this pilot mechanism, I would like you to use this checklist. It makes it a lot easier for the reviewers. It doesn't have to be in this order, but everything they're expecting to see will then be in the grant that they're reviewing. And I strongly recommend you use it with your mentors as you're getting NIH grants together. All right. Any questions about the RFA? Okay, or the specific aims checklist? All right. So, I'm sorry, I didn't realize this. The last time I talked about these two things are rebranded. I should have rebranded this Excel. So apologies to Mike Peterson if he ever watches this video. But these slides were in the context of talking to some INBRE funded investigators about their next steps, like building their submission, right? So as you are moving ahead, and some of you have probably written grants and gotten reviews, but as you build any submission, you want to make sure you understand the specific process for that grant. And they're not all exactly the same. In fact, some RFAs or requests for application are reviewed differently, have different criteria even, or different components that are required than other grants. So make sure you understand the grant and the review process. Make sure you understand how the components all tie together and that you look at the timeline early on, especially the administrative things that need to get done. And it varies from institution to institution how you get the administrative support to make sure that you can meet the timeline and get things submitted. I know Christiana expects certain information X number of weeks ahead of a submission. UD also, Nemours has a different set of rules, but review that early so that you can set up how you're going to approach certain things, like getting letters, making sure you have bio sketches, getting budgets. If you're going to work with another institution, getting the budget figured out and how it's going to work between the two places. Try to understand how other grants succeeded. The one thing I showed you was the specific aims structure, but talk to your mentors about other things that they've done or and we'll talk a little bit about some of my experiences with study sections and things that work. Make sure you map out how you're going to get things done and get your sections reviewed by other people. This is often difficult, right?
Not too bad.
Hey, make sure you get things reviewed early and often. And in yellow, kind of bold, all capital, double underline with exclamation points is contact the program officer. It's they can be your best friends. And this is specific to the NIH. And also other funding mechanisms. But the program officers are the ones that have portfolios of research in the area that you're interested in. I've had program officers who just anecdotally, I've had program officers who reviewed my specific aims. They're not part of the review process. And if they really like what you're working on, conceptually like the overall idea, they can be a wealth of information about how to fine-tune things. So I had program officers telling me to reword aims because he didn't think the specific study section would like that particular terminology. And that seems like a simple thing. Why would the term you use actually matter? But from his experience, it did. And I've had tremendous success with program officers. Their job. So there's a review group that we'll talk a little bit more about that's distinct from the program group. And they're, for conflict of interest reasons and a number of other logistical reasons, they're completely separate. So the program officers are the ones that essentially are sponsoring your research with funding that flows through their program at the institute where they work. So contact them if you have trouble finding one or figuring one out. Maybe another time we can talk about how to find a program officer. just find one that sounds close. And they're all really busy, but if you can get to talk to them, they know everybody else. They might suggest someone else that you would be more interested, that would be very interested in talking to you. And just ask lots of questions as you start to build your submission. And that could be through, the mentoring core, through your mentors, through your admins, but just ask a lot of questions. All right, so understand the grant review process is where we're going to focus a little bit here. And again, this is from a lot of these slides. A lot of the mentoring groups share things back and forth. So between us and MUSC, and Rick's been great, and other institutions have been great about sharing their slides. So I adopted some of what he has put together, and the following 5 slides from his Climb program. And there's a PDF where he talks about research career development in a broader context that includes these things. Okay, so why would you want to focus on grant reviewing before thinking about grant writing? So when you write a grant in science, you're writing for a specific audience. You're always writing for a specific audience when you write a manuscript, when you write your proposals, when you write your reports. So to be successful at that writing, you have to understand from the very beginning certain things about that audience. So you would want to write in a way that reviewers are used to seeing. And one of the ways I suggest thinking of reviewers, and I review a lot these days, is that we really want to help, but we are tired and we're a little bit cranky. And if you make it hard for us to help you, it will be hard for us to help you. So it might seem neat to rearrange things, and it's great to be creative, but you really want things to be sort of all the things there that they're expecting to see, and nothing really missing, so that they don't have to hunt around and look for it. So what they're used to seeing, what they want to see, the criteria they use when they're judging what they read, and how they're going to approach their task, which is to take the information you've given them in this written document and decide whether or not the way it's set up and structured is great science, great idea, perfect person to do it. Sort of think back to some of the things we talked about in the specific aims page. So your task is to take that willingness of the reviewer to advocate for you and make their job as simple as possible. Convince them that your work is important, that you know what you're doing, and you can conduct the research that you propose. And if you kind of think about your grant in that way and keep in mind you're asking someone for a lot of work. It's not a small amount of effort to review a grant, and use that information, right? You've got this specific audience and these ideas that you want to communicate to structure your proposal. I think automatically your proposal is much stronger. Okay, so who sits on review panels? And there are different types of reviewers that sit on study sections. There are people who are experts in what you do. They know as much or even more about the specific topic area. There are very sophisticated and astute non-experts who may not be as well versed as you are in the content area, but are excellent in highly sophisticated in their approach to science. There are very skilled scientists who know almost nothing about what you're working on, who sit on the study section. And study sections look at hundreds of potential reviews over the course of a year. So they aggregate together, and certain topic areas flow to those study sections. But there will be people sitting in that room and around the table that know almost nothing. There are also often technical experts, biostats people, epidemiologists. For some infrastructure grants, there's architects that sit on study sections, and they have a very specific thing that they might want to talk about. And non-scientists even, who may still have a lot of input, architects, for example, into review decisions and outcomes. So you need to know your reviewers. And if you thought about the study section that you want to apply to, the panel composition is posted from not necessarily the one that's going to review your grant, but the previous ones. And in fact, online, the study sections have their own web pages that talk about the kinds of things that are reviewed by those panels and sort of the things that they're looking for. So if you've narrowed down with a program officer, hopefully the study section, you want to go and look at those things, figure out who's on them, what's the general composition. A lot of MDs, a lot of PhDs. For me, because we are in this tissue engineering and regenerative medicine field, there's often a mixture of PhDs, MDs, and engineers all on the same panel. So when we write, or people in my field write, you have to be able to cover all three of those kinds of approaches in the document. Because if you lose a third of the reviewers in your explanation, your grant might do okay, but you really want your grant to do stellar for it to get funded. All right, so the process, so once you know your audience, the process for NIH is you come up with your idea, your question, your hypothesis, the thing you're going to test. It might be something brand new that you thought of, investigator initiated. It might be something that's from an announcement. So an RFA is a request for application, or a PA is a program announcement. Either way, you've got to kind of come up with what it is that you want to work on. You follow the guidelines within that specific mechanism for funding, and your institutional admins, your sponsored projects people can help you with some of the nitty-gritty, some of the guidelines associated with how your biosketch needs to be configured and what you need to include in the budget. And when the budget gets to a certain point, what additional work do you have to do? The grants are now almost, I think everything for NIH is now, all of the general grants are electronically submitted. I don't think there are any mechanisms that are paper submitted anymore. And then once it gets to NIH, it's assigned to an institute or center. And in your cover letter, you can request what institute or center. So Child Health and Human Development is an institute, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. So your proposal will get assigned to one of those based on the discipline you're working in and their mission. I would recommend that you ask for multiple assignments whenever possible. So some of the work I do, for example, is in cardiovascular research, and it's also in biomedical engineering. So I routinely ask for heart, lung, and blood and NIBIB as multiple assignments. What that does for you, there will be one institute that's prime, but the other one will be listed as well. If your grant gets reviewed but isn't necessarily going to pay in the first, say, heart, lung, and blood for me, you can request to switch it to the other one. In fact, the program officers will already know and might work that situation out amongst themselves. So the institutes on the program side. In addition, your grant gets assigned to a scientific review group, which is often referred to as a study section or a review panel. Those might be specific to the institute, or they might be specific to topics. And how the review panel is comprised is often explained in the RFA or the PA. The standing study sections are associated essentially by topic, although depending on the topic, that study section might generally have their grants. So the grants they review flow back to a specific institute. All right. If you have questions, I guess just interrupt me because I don't know how to make it so that you can raise your hand. Okay.
What's the best way to contact the PO?
It's still, you cold call them. I mean, actually, the best way is at a meeting, at a conference. So large conferences, so I have cardiovascular research and neuroscience research. I mentioned the cardiovascular stuff, but I go to the Society for Neuroscience meetings, and NIH is there every year, and the program officers come. So you can just go to the NIH booth and get information about which program officers should I talk to. But you're essentially kind of cold calling on them to ask them a question. So the best way to contact them is however you can. In person at a meeting, call them, but don't be offended if they don't call back. They're amazingly busy, and email them. And you have to explain to them very succinctly what it is. Tell them for sure that you're a new investigator, the area of interest, and the grant mechanism that you're considering, and that you would like to talk to them about the construction of your grant and the prospects for it. But it's a cold call at the end of the day.
Should you ever try to visit them? I've heard of some PIs went and did a short visit.
I only visit people I already know. I don't know, and that might be successful, but I don't know. I can't think of anyone that I know that's gone to meet with a program officer as their first meeting. But meeting, maybe the more, the program officer can kind of understand who you are, the kind of work you do, how you work, and your interests, the more they'll be able to gauge whether or not you mesh with the portfolio they're putting together, right? And you can kind of think of a program officer has a set of grants that they're responsible for, and they want those grants to succeed and move ahead and get refunded, and they want the investigators to do well. So they're looking to try to make as good of a match as they can. So talking to program officers in person is great. I don't, and I can't recommend whether that works or not as a first shot, but I know talking to program officers after you know them and you have another idea, or you're coming up for your renewal, or you have another grant that went in and it's not doing that great, or you talked to them on the phone and you sent the grant to a study section after you talked to them and it came back and they got hammered. So you call them up and they're expressed surprise that they're surprised it was that. And then you can offer to come down and see them. And where we are, it's not easy to get to Bethesda first thing in the morning because of traffic, but it's not that far. Depending where you are in the state, it's a couple hours to get down to NIH. But, my suggestion would be talk to them by phone or email first and then sort out, well, who's the program officer who's got the portfolio that matches your interests the most.
Can I add something, Rob?
Sure. Melissa.
Yeah. So I actually would, rather than cold calling, I would recommend putting together a really nice specific page and sending that in an email first and asking for a time to discuss it. I think because then you can give the person time to really think carefully about what your work is and be prepared with what they think is going to be a really good response to it. The risk of cold calling, you catch people by surprise. Even if you get them, you catch them by surprise and they might not be paying that much attention. You know what else they've got on their plate that day. But if you set up an appointment, give them something in writing to look at, then you don't know that they're really going to put some thought into it, but I think it increases the odds.
Yeah.
Putting some thought into it. And
that's a great point. I've worked with multiple program officers. They all ask for an Ames page. So in their world, that's how they track what's going to be proposed or has been proposed. Those Ames get tracked through with you when you're doing your annual reports down the road. But yeah, I agree with that. That's a good point. I'm old, I guess, because and there are some program officers that I know that don't like email, but I already know them, so I can call and sort of set up a time to talk about a new idea. But yeah, that's an excellent point. And they will ask for Ames pages. So, and I suggest using that checklist because they're going to be expecting to see that information, or at least you want to communicate that information to them so that they can help you. And they no matter how grumpy they are, reviewers too, you always have to kind of take the posture that they're trying to help you. They wouldn't bother at all if they weren't trying to help you. So whether you get pink or critiques back that sound nasty, try not to take it that way. Just the reviewer was having a bad day, didn't word things well, but they honestly are trying to help you. And the same thing with the program officers. Some are grumpy, some are great, some are I've had program officers call me. I'll talk to them about Ames, like Melissa. It's Dr. Harrington down at Delaware State University, who's a PI on a COBRE grant. But I've had a conversation with a program officer, and then she called me like 3 days later saying she had more thoughts about it. Not all of them work that way. They are focused on you for the time that they're reading the email or meeting with you or talking to you, and then they got 90,000 other things to do, and you're gone. But try to get in touch with them. They are one of the biggest resources you can tap into. So once your beautiful grant goes in and you hustled and pulled everything together and it's assigned, it sits around for a few months being processed. And it takes about 4 months on average for the peer review process to begin. And generally, this varies a little bit, but the grant will be assigned to 3 reviewers, a primary, secondary, and then someone who may be a third reviewer who does a full review, or someone who's a reader who just comments on specific areas. And that depends on the study section and what's called the SRO, or the Scientific Review Officer. So the SRO is the person who makes those assignments. He or she's in charge of the review panel, and they are distinct and separate from the program officers. They're in a completely different section of NIH. So they'll assign 3 people who are on the committee. They might be standing members. They might be people invited to attend the committee as ad hoc members for the purposes of reviewing your grant and others in the area. We reviewers now read things electronically from a link on ERA Commons, and we start compiling our comments and, in fact, upload them with a score. And the scores are from 1 being great to 9 being not that great. So you have to put your own scores and your comments in before you can see anybody else's. But once you do that, so if you're a reviewer and you have 10 grants, which isn't unusual, to review, you have to get all of your initial comments together and your scores in, and then you see everyone else's, and you can take a look and kind of get ready for the discussion that will follow. And then just before the meeting, the scientific review officer, and there's a scientist who chairs the study section, and they look at all the preliminary scores, and usually the bottom 50% don't get discussed. And that's largely because of the volume of grants that come in. So study section members only talk about the top 50%. The comments that were written go to the PI, but there's no discussion of them. So if Dr. Harrington read your grant and she gave you 1s across the board, which means perfect grant, and I read your grant and I was like, wow, this is a 3, this is a 5, I really need to work on this, and the aggregate score put you below 50%, we don't talk about it. So that kind of stinks, because you're sometimes left with these disparate comments from the reviewers, but it is what it is at that point. Reviewers can, generally in study sections, reviewers can pull a grant from below that discussion line and force it to be discussed. But in my experience, that happens at the end of a meeting that's often a day and a half or 2 days long of grants, and people are wanting to go catch their planes and go home. And it's happened a few times, and it's usually because there was clearly a misunderstanding between the reviewers. So they wanted to get it so it was discussed and get another set of votes. And the entire committee votes for grants that are discussed, everybody on the committee, and there might be 30 people in the room, votes. So there are occasions where things get pulled from the triage, and we're not supposed to use that term, from the streamlined grants. But in my experience, that's unusual. And Melissa, could you mute your phone?
Do I have my phone?
Could you mute it?
Oh.
Thanks. All right. So then the panel meets. The proposals are grouped often by type. So RO, or BMPI, the study section that it was on most recently, does RO ones first. I think that's pretty typical. And in rank order. So we always talk about the top score first. The idea being that those are quick. Usually there's the reviewers, the 3 reviewers all agree, great grant, not much to discuss. There's a couple things here and there, and then the committee votes. And the group tries to get through those relatively quickly so that we then get to the grants that are in more of that hinterland, where some people think they're pretty good and some people think they're awesome, and try to calibrate the scores so that we get a reasonable estimate of what the actual merit of the proposal is. So after that, so you go through and rank, and then when you get to that 50% mark, often the SRO would say, does anyone want to discuss any of these others? And then you move on. After discussion, everybody on the panel gives a confidential score. The 3 reviewers say their score. So if I started off that your overall impact was a 2, and after discussion, I realize you're a 4, that I would say it at the beginning and at the end. Everyone else then records. It's now electronic, and in some places still do it on paper as a backup. gets recorded confidentially. So I just want to think about that for a minute. If there's 3 reviewers and 2 of them really, really love your grant, and the third one is kind of wishy-washy and it gives it a 3 or a 4, which typically is borderline fundable, everyone else has to decide who they agree with. And they can ask questions and discuss, but what you really want to have happen, and you can control it, is to have a champion for your grant on a study section, and that person really loves your grant, and that they will counter anything that's viewed as a weakness in front of the whole study section. So at the end, if you have 2 reviewers that say 1 and 1 that says 4, the rest of the panel goes, well, it's closer to a 1 because of what I heard. You can't control that, but that's one of the dynamics that happens on study sections. So after that discussion of everybody, there's a summary that's prepared. And for those of you who have submitted and gotten your critiques back, that's the most important thing to look at and think about, because that's what the committee actually focused on and talked about. And at the end, the chair usually summarizes. So what I heard was that the investigators are fantastic. This is a great environment, but it's not clear that they have the necessary equipment or that they have enough preliminary data to support hypothesis in aim number 3. And then everyone, says whether or not they agree with that assessment, and that's what you get to see. But because that reflects what was actually discussed, as opposed to the specific comments which were written by the reviewers and the reviewers can modify them, the discussion is the main thing. Those are usually the big things that you have to address. The final scores that you get to a percentile rank. This happens in most cases. Some mechanisms, some study sections, some RFAs don't give you a percentile rank because they don't have enough data really to put a percentile. So you might get a grant that scores 25, and that's 15th percentile. That just means the average score of 2.5, it's multiplied up. For that study section over time, that's the top 15% of what they look at. It's the percentile in the long run that really matters. And it allows comparison across different groups and different vagaries of study sections. So these special emphasis panels in some study sections don't do that. You just get a score because they don't have enough confidence in the percentile rank. Those things go back to the program officer. So now you're going from the decision side. Is this something that has high merit? What's the score? What's the impact? Back to the program at the institute for potential funding. So one of the reasons you want to talk to the program officer ahead of time is because you want to have your grant, now that you've worked really hard to write, a great review by study section, come back to a program officer that already loves it and wants to put it in their portfolio. The decisions for what gets funded are made at what's called the advisory council or council meeting, and they meet. The NIH submissions are 3 times a year. Council is offset, so a couple months, I guess, after the study section meets, council will meet to consider funding and where they're going to draw what's called the pay line. So if they have enough money to pay the top 20%, which has happened in the past and not necessarily recently, then they'll pay all the way down to that percentile. And they meet 3 times a year. All right, so then you get your announcement. Actually, these things are now online, so you hear quickly about your score. A lot of times council is delayed, especially these days. And council will carry, so if you see, like my grant ended up a bit heart, lung, and blood, they will carry a grant from one council meeting to the next. So they might not pay it at the first meeting after it got the score, but they might decide, or it might make it below the pay line at the next one. So there are a couple of resources to check out here. Oops, I gotta get out of there. Yes, hang on. I'm just gonna quickly to these. All right, these are both NIH, and there's tons of other resources online, but these 2 in particular, I wanted you to know about. Can you guys see Internet Explorer? I forget how I shared. You should be seeing Internet Explorer as long as I shared.
We can see it, Rob.
Okay. So there's an entire website that NIH has recently put together about peer review policies and practices. And it is a wealth of information about ins and outs of changes that are coming, changes that have been initiated. And you can see this is updated in June. They do it every few months. There's a new sort of update on here. So it's a wealth of information. These are notices that are specifically published. So information about the new, no longer that new BioSketch format can be found in those notices. So that's one to take a look at. The other that I want to show you are these videos, which are great. And I recommend this particular one. I think this links right to the video. Gives you an example of how a study section works. Let's see. Oh, they have more on here. I think this is the one. Right, so they did a mock study section, and NIH has a YouTube channel, which you might expect. I don't know how the audio works on this, but they actually introduce the study section and then have commentary from well-established investigators who have worked on study sections for a long time. So this is just an example of what a study section might look like. You got the reviewers sitting around the table and then a bunch of people in the background who are program officers and administrators for the different institutes. But I highly recommend watching this. It's interesting because sort of the language they use and the tenor of it is very similar to the way the VMBI study section used to work. Not all of them work the same way, but it really gives you a flavor for the discussion. One of the things that if you become a reviewer, you learn is you have very little time to discuss even an R01 that might have taken the applicants 3 months to write, and it took you liked it, so you really wanted to make sure you dug into it, and maybe you worked on it for 3 or 4 hours. And it does take a significant amount of time with some grants that the entire discussion, because of the number of grants have to be discussed, happens in 10 minutes. So it's eye-opening to serve on a study section or to watch how this is done, because the reviewers are expected to kind of dissect right down to what the issues are, the problems, the questions, the strengths, and present those to the committee in a way that allows discussion, the decision to be made on your beautiful multi-million-dollar, many months worth of effort grant. And I bring that up because, and I tried to make this point several times, they're trying, I mean, the reviewers are trying to help. You have to make it easy for them. And at the end of the day, their job's really hard. And there's not a lot of thank yous for reviewers. Typically, the feedback you get is nil on how you're reviewing is. You can, if you get contacted by other SROs, in general, that means you're a good reviewer because they talk to each other. And if you have insightful comments and you are dedicated to reviewing, you'll get contacted to be on more study sections. So I recommend taking a look at those things. Does anybody have any questions? I want to tell you a couple of stories about my experience with study section. Yeah, any questions?
Rob, you've muted your microphone. Okay, you're back.
Am I back? So there were, I've been through multiple study sections. Actually, other people could mute theirs. I think my system is feeding back a little bit. So early on in my career, I had a study section experience, and I'm going to tell you about this. It shouldn't ever happen again, but it happened to me, and NIH was extraordinarily helpful in trying to figure out what to do. But I had a grant that went in that had 3 reviewers, and the score came back. This was in cardiac physiology and associated with when you get a score back, it's either, I mean, really there's only two scores, let's be honest. The grant's going to get money or the grant's not going to get money. So in those two things, there's a distribution that's sort of payable grants, and there's a distribution of grants that are kind of parked that need some fixes to them. So my grant was in that lower category. But the scores were encouraging. And when I went through the critiques, the third review had nothing to do with my grant. It was completely unassociated. It had nothing, it was the hypothesis that they dinged wasn't my hypothesis. The field wasn't my field. It didn't have anything to do with the system, with what I had proposed to do. So I didn't know the SRO, and I was still new to this, but I knew the program officer a little bit. So I called her, and she said, well, that shouldn't happen. You should contact the scientific review officer and see what could be done about it. Because in reality, the person probably just clicked the wrong thing when they uploaded the grant. So I did that, and the SRO claimed that he couldn't track back to which, or the reviewer couldn't track back, or the reviewer hadn't actually reviewed the grant. Something along those lines had actually occurred. So we had no idea what to do. So I worked with the program officer. I had to resubmit, and I just based it on the other two. And she actually helped me structure the introduction and explain about what happened, and kind of work behind the scenes with the SRO from the next study section to make sure that the grant was reviewed properly, right? So that it was unclear to me even if the scores that were entered were appropriate to that grant. I'm telling you this story, one, it was a horrifying experience, but two, I wasn't quiet about it. And I asked a lot of questions, and I called a lot of people. And at the end of the day, NIH was, not happy to, but they were willing to work with me and to make sure that there was an explanation, in that I didn't have to spend half of my introduction explaining how all of these comments from reviewer number 3 were unrelated. But it was heart-wrenching, and it was difficult. And ultimately, that resubmission didn't get funded, but ultimately that idea did get funded, and they were extremely helpful with that. But two things. So one is, if you're a PI and you submit a grant and you get something back that seems, and nothing could be worse than getting a comment that don't have anything to do with your grant, but you get things back that sound kind of strange, call the program officer. They often sit in on these meetings and see if he or she can explain what happened, and try to figure out with you, well, what is it that can be done about addressing these things? And two, don't take it so hard that, I could have just looked at that and said, well, I'm done. Like, how am I going to address this? It's not even my work. Don't take any of the comments so personally that you don't want to continue on. It could be, the worst thing is that maybe you have to rethink how you're approaching the overall problem that you want to look at. If you get scores back in comments that kind of suggest, this thing's not going to get funded, then you need to take a step back, stay committed to the overall goal, because that's what you want to do, and retool. But I want to encourage people to be thick-skinned about the comments they get back, and to call your program officer and call people about any questions or comments or problems that you've got with the reviews. They're exceptionally helpful. Does anybody close? I'm happy to answer any questions. I've reviewed for NIH, multiple study sections, the VA, multiple different foundations. I've written lots of grants. If anybody has any specific questions about how to think about putting your grant together, or resources that you can tap into, or anything like that, you can ask me. And now would be a good time. Anyone? All right. So it's almost 1 o'clock. If anyone has questions, and Aaron, I'll send you the information, the 2 documents that I used.
Sounds good.
Okay, and you can share them with the group. And if you guys have questions offline, or you want to contact me, just give me a call. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.